We came in. I had a larger video planned for today, but I got busy working on a bunch of other stuff in life, so yeah, unfortunately, I will not be talking about Pink Floyd as a general topic today, but I will be talking about The Wall, because when this video comes out, The Wall would have turned 40 years old. It was first released in 1979, and since then has had quite a bit of things happen with it. It had a film. It was toured in 1981, I believe, and that tour made like no money. Eventually, it was re-toured again by Roger Waters, and that made a shit ton of money. I think that happened in like 2011, and it lasted for a couple of years. Point is, when I found out about this album, it was only about 2.5 years ago. It was in 9th grade. Like late 9th grade. I listened to it for the first time while working on a bunch of other projects. But how I found out about The Wall was because of an interesting inclusion on a classic rock playlist by Spotify. If you aren't familiar with Spotify, some of the things that they'll do is they'll actually have themed playlists. So you can have like 80s metal, you can have 70s classic rock. In this case, I was listening to the latter. And one of the tracks on there was Another Brick in the Wall Part 2. And I saw the title and was like, okay, what's Part 1? So I listened to Part 1, then skipped to Part 2, and wondered why the fuck Part 2 just began what sounded like in the middle of a song. Eventually I found out the composition techniques used by Pink Floyd pretty much after Metal, I would say. The album Metal, they didn't do metal music. I don't think at any point. But anyway, where one of the things that Pink Floyd does, and this was mind-blowing to me when I first found out about this when listening to The Wall, is they will make an entire side of the album continuous. In fact, they'll just make it where one song flows into the next song, into the next song, into the next song. And I'd say that mixed with really just me listening to the whole album in one sitting resulted in me, about 80 minutes after I began the album, finishing it, realizing I had just listened to something. I don't know what it was. I knew that there was some stuff to it, but it was this thing that I knew I had to listen to again, because there was something there. Yeah, there was definitely something there that I knew I had missed, and I need to listen to again. So I listened to The Wall again, and then again, and again, and a few more times until I realized I really love this album, but I should probably stop listening to it on loop every single day because I'll probably get sick of it. And because of that, I only listen to the album maybe like 5 times a year, just because I don't like to touch this album a lot, because if I do listen to an album a lot, I will get tired of it. And, yeah, my patience with music runs thin kind of quickly, which is why, like, I can't stand a lot of pop music, because it's only 2 minutes long for, like, each song. And if you hear the same song, like, 3 times a day for a couple of weeks, you kind of get pissed off with that song. Anyway, actually talking about The Wall now. The Wall is an album that I think a lot of people, if they haven't listened to it, when they do listen to it, will enjoy it a lot. I will say this, that it is not the album that most people tend to say is Pink Floyd's greatest album. That actually tends to be Dark Side of the Moon, then like Wish You Were Here, and then maybe this one if it's not passed by Animals. And many will say that this is their darkest album, and I would contend that. This is, in terms of the presentation, the themes, all of that, definitely one of their darker albums. I'd say that there are probably a couple of parts on Animals that are pretty dark. Same for Wish You Were Here. But in terms of just the overall tone, and really kind of almost pessimistic and, in a way, maybe even nihilistic kind of nature of the album, it definitely does feel like the darkest Pink Floyd album from the 70s. So what's the album about, since I've already talked for a couple of minutes just about my experience finding the album? It's a rock opera looking at the story of a rock star that basically just starts to hate everyone. He feels really disconnected from everyone. He starts to fear some people. And so he just starts isolating himself from everyone. He puts a wall around himself. And then over the duration of his life, he builds up the wall. He expands the wall. He makes it bigger. Really, this is an album that tells a story that you aren't going to get the first time that you listen to it. I didn't get it the first time I listened to it. Maybe it's because I listen to things by its sound first as opposed to its lyrics. I know that some people it is the opposite, where they'll listen to the lyrics and not pay much attention to the sound. But for me, I like to listen to the sound of music before the words of music. So when I first listened to this album, I picked up on how kind of awesome it was sounding. It starts off with a literal bang. If you listen to the track In the Flesh, track 1 of side 1, it starts off quiet. There's a little bit of music in there with what I believe is a flute playing. And then you have the drums kick in with a guitar. And from there, oh man, you know you're in for something. You know that what's going to happen is this is going to be the most important thing you listen to today, and perhaps even for the rest of your life. Okay, that part might be a bit of an overstatement, but you get my point, is that this starts off saying, we are here, this is going to be huge, now listen to this for the next 80 minutes. And from there, really, the dynamics on the album is what also helps sell it, because not only do you have the loud, intense parts, like in the beginning, but you also have some of the more drawn back parts. Like the next track, The Thin Ice, starts off with a baby crying. And then what is not really a lullaby, more so like a poem that a mom, voiced by David Gilmour. I guess sung by David Gilmour, not really voiced by him, but you get what I mean. It starts off with the mom talking about how she loves her baby. And then eventually when the thin ice does break, that's when you have the soaring guitars again. That's when it goes into a little bit of a guitar solo, not really a long one, that then goes into Another Brick in the Wall Part 1, which once again is quiet. Eventually it starts to slowly build up through like the happiest days of our lives into Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, which if you've heard Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, it's the one that goes... Most people have probably heard Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 and probably know The Wall because of Another Brick in the Wall Part 2. And then the side of the album, the first side of the album ends with Mother, which kind of just draws it back a little bit. It does get a little bit louder towards the end, but really the point that I'm making here just by looking at side 1 of the album is that it uses dynamics very well, where it's not just we are in your face screaming at you. More so, we're looking at the different kind of facets of life. Just by looking at this album, you have like we're starting the story of my life, like with the protagonist being the Pink Floyd character. You have in the beginning, we're gonna look at my life. Next track, I'm a baby. Next track, my dad's dead. Next track, just talking about teachers and really just shit teachers. The next track, really just a statement protesting the UK education system, which, as much as I'm aware that the American education system is not like the UK education system in what I would believe to be like the late 50s, early 60s, pretty much. In terms of just it being shit overall, yeah, I think the feeling there is shared with this current generation as well, with, funny enough, the boomer generation, technically, since this is Pink Floyd. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, and then track 6 on side 1, it just talks about, really how parents will basically feed their children their own fears, if you think about it. And that I'll probably talk about in a minute, but why I'm mentioning all this with side 1, it does follow the life of a character. It starts at the beginning, and then eventually by the end, you have what some people would say... There's a little bit of spoilers, but because it's more of interpretation, I'll spoil, quote-unquote, this. But what is basically the death of the character. And if you look at it that way, you can also look at it as a cycle. There's another way of looking at it like that. I won't tell you exactly how, because I do want to try and keep some of this album still fresh if you do decide to listen to it. But this album is made where it is supposed to look at someone's life. And someone's life sometimes could be non-stop, always going. And there is a part on this album and a section on another part of this album that is kind of like that. But it will sometimes just resolve back to a quieter, a little bit calm, maybe even to some people perhaps a little anxious kind of musical landscape on some of the songs. And I think that just overall, the point I'm getting at here is the composition on the album is genius. It really does look at life and consider life and form the whole album around that in order to talk about the themes of isolation. So, I don't think I'm alone here in saying that, pardon the shitty pun, whatever, I don't think I'm alone here in saying that most people have felt isolation before. And I think that that theme is quite the universal subject, as something that most people could get from this album. I don't think there's really anyone in the modern day who hasn't felt alone at some point, or even the desire to separate themselves from the entirety of society. And that's pretty much the main focal point of this album. Now, yes, there are other themes in here. As I said, there's the education theme, the basically the failure of the education system theme on Happiest Days and Another Brick in the Wall. There's also like a reflection on basically becoming more distant with your lover through the song Empty Spaces. There's actually a pretty significant war theme on the whole album. To explain that one real quick, Roger Waters, the main vocalist on this album, he wrote most of the lyrics for the album. So one of the things is that his dad actually died in World War II, which is where the dead father idea comes from with Part 1, Another Brick in the Wall Part 1, and the anti-war sentiment seems to also stem from. That's why you get kind of out of what on the surface is a little out of place, the inclusion of what sounds like World War II documentary sounds, just like the audio tracks of it on side 3 of the album. You get that on basically the transition space between Is There Anyone Out There, Nobody Home, Nobody Home, and Vera. You also get kind of a march, like a military march type of sound, even with the song Bring the Boys Back Home. Point is here, why I bring this up, is that is another theme that also seems to be a little prevalent here. And I would argue, I haven't looked into it too much because it's not one that really latched onto me as much. I could see people definitely making that as a more primary theme on this album. And it would be a fair one as well, especially considering side 4. But yeah, the point that I make here about the whole themes is that these themes are pretty universal. And I think that is what makes this album really appealing, and what made this album really appealing to me as what would kind of be, I guess it would kind of be my second rock opera. I listened to Green Day's American Idiot, I think like 2 years before I listened to The Wall. But in terms of like an album that really changed my perspective on how music could be done, yeah, The Wall definitely does that. The Wall definitely did that for me in terms of just how songs could be constructed. Like I didn't really consider the idea of each song on album or each track on album literally just leading into the next track, where you can have like 20-minute segments of the album, or even in some later albums I listened to, where the whole album just is a continuous flow from beginning to end. Now, if the technology existed when Pink Floyd was still making music like this, then yeah, absolutely, I bet you this whole album, they probably would have gotten to fit on like one CD and just made it where it was a solid 80 minutes of music. But you have to consider that this was made in 1979. The primary medium for listening to music are all records. Yeah, because of that, you do get a little bit of limitation where you can kind of tell on certain tracks, like Mother, Goodbye Cruel World, Comfortably Numb, and Outside the Wall, where basically each side ends. That's pretty much what happens. And if you could overlook that, if there was a way of actually listening to the album continuously, which I suppose there could be, if they did a, even though it would, I would think it would actually kind of lessen the whole originality of the wall a little bit if they were to remaster it this way. But if they could make it where all the tracks went into each other, because yeah, okay, I'll finish that statement. If they could make it where all the tracks went into each other, I think that would probably be an even more fuller experience. However, I actually don't think that is needed. And the reason why is because I think there is something significant about the breaks in each of these, every couple of songs where you would have to flip the record. I think that is actually significant because if you're listening to this on vinyl, which I could do because I have the records here. Basically, whenever you get to the end of the 20 minutes on each side of a record, you have to get up and flip it over. And whenever you physically do that, you're technically, in a way, just flipping a page to a new chapter in the story. And when you consider it that way, having the breaks between these songs actually makes the whole album feel even more like a story, as opposed to just something that you can listen to and just forget parts of. Every time there is that break, and a noticeable break at that, it kind of resets you into back into the album. In addition to if you do have to physically pick up the vinyl and flip it over or put a new one on there. The action of even just putting a new one on there really signifying the part 2 of the story. I think it unintentionally has an even more significant impact in the story because of the need for a physical interaction or the physical ability to notice such a thing even in a digital medium. So I've talked about the physical part of the album a bit. So that's another thing that exists with the wall as I pull out one of the records, is this album has more to it than just the music, which I think is pretty cool. Of course, I think an album's main strength has to be the music. If you have a shit-sounding album, then who the fuck cares about all the artwork? Your album just sounds like shit. But this album sounds really good. It has some really good songs on it, so I think the fact that it does have also a good visual component, that just serves as a bonus and really help with perhaps a little bit more of the storytelling that may not have been entirely possible with just listening to the music. So, for instance, I'm looking at the first record here with side 1 and 2, and like you have images of the little characters, like the teacher on side 1. If I flip over to side 2, you have an image of the wife, another character in the rock opera. I'd have to actually pull out the second vinyl, and that'll take a little bit of time. But on that one, I believe side 3 has the mother character on it, even though that would be probably more appropriate for side 1, actually. And then side 4 has the lawyer character on the trial. But yeah, the artwork is a little limited in terms of how much you get of it. You don't get like an art book with the vinyl, just like the regular vinyl. I think in the Immersion set, which was released a couple years ago, you would get stuff like that. But looking at how it would have been released normally and how the average consumer would get it, you do actually get a decent amount of artwork because it is just in the gatefold. And it is enough to kind of tell you what certain scenes of the album look like. For instance, I'm looking at the left side right now, and it has a scene from the trial. On the screen, I've actually cropped out a good amount of it because I do want some surprises to be here. But then if you look on the right side, you then have the previously mentioned characters of like the mother, the wife, the teacher. Shit, on YouTube, I'm gonna have to censor out the wife a little bit. Yeah, that's another thing. The artwork on this album is a little dark, and some could even call it a tiny bit perverted in some cases, especially if you look at the film. Oh yeah, that's another thing. This album had a film adaptation made in 1983, which is pretty good. I wish that they would release a fucking Blu-ray version of it. I was hoping that they would announce something for the 40th anniversary, but I don't know. I guess Roger Waters or Pink Floyd or whoever's in charge of the brand management or whatever just forgot that this album's turning 40. So yeah, that kind of sucks because I would love to have like at least a 1080p version of the film, preferably a 4K version to future-proof it a little bit. But Come on, guys. The only way for most people to even really watch the film is going to be through the DVD release from like 15 years ago. I think because it specifically still says the 25th anniversary of the album. So come on, guys. Please, can someone just say, hey, look, it's been a while, why don't we release the film on Blu-ray? Or on anything, like, why is it not on, like, Amazon Prime or Netflix? Like, why is it not online? Why hasn't it been updated at all in the past 15 years? I don't know. There's also apparently some concert footage that is just not, it doesn't exist or something, or it does, or it's just being held hostage or whatever. It's just been ignored or whatever. I've heard that film processing techniques have gotten a lot better, like physical film processing techniques, where a problem that they had with that concert footage is it was just too dark, but now they could probably remaster it where you could actually see some shit. Come on, guys. There's so much material with The Wall that, I can't experience some of this stuff literally because I'm too young. Like, I can't experience a Wall concert because I wasn't into The Wall when, like, Roger Waters was touring it earlier this decade. And I certainly couldn't have watched an original performance of The Wall in the 80s because I wasn't fucking alive even in the 90s. So, point is that there is a good amount of visual material for the album that really helps with it and really shows you, in some cases with the live stuff, I would assume it would show you really the grand scale of The Wall and what Pink Floyd was able to do visually. Like, they built a fucking wall on stage. They built a wall on stage and collapsed it at the end of the concert, apparently. I want to see that. I haven't been to a concert where they've done theatrics like that before, and man, I want to see something like that. That's just fucking cool that they would build a wall, put the whole band behind it, but then have, I've seen some stuff from, like, Roger Waters' The Wall, the, documentary that they made around his tour of The Wall. And if anything that they were trying to do in the 80s was like what he did earlier this decade, that would have been fucking awesome to see, man. That would have been so awesome to watch, and fuck, that would have been awesome to watch this decade if I would have known about and would have been interested in The Wall and all that, but I suppose life is not free of regrets, maybe. I don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, back to The Wall, because I've rambled a little bit about auxiliary stuff of The Wall. There is a lot with The Wall that could be talked about in great detail. And there are videos that do a better job on this on YouTube. But I just wanted to talk about The Wall a little bit and talk about what I fucking love about it. Now, of course, I will say this, is that, yeah, having all this extra stuff with it, all the, just, really the artistry and the work that went into this album, I think all that really shows in really just the music itself, but then all the other extra stuff that went with it. Like, I thought it was really cool when I found out that this album was turned into a film, though granted The Who did that twice by this point, with Tommy and Quadrophenia. But, like, just the amount of extra stuff that happened with The Wall. Like, there is so much visual stuff with this because of the film and as well the animations that came with The Wall. Like, the trial sequence is incredible. In fact, I should just talk about side 4 real quick of The Wall. So, side 4 comes after Comfortably Numb, which ends with... Oh, man. That's actually the first Pink Floyd song I listened to because of a guitar lesson. I think it was like my 5th or something guitar lesson, like 3.5 years ago. But anyway, like, I had already heard about Comfortably Numb and had listened to that, and oh, man, that solo. Like, some people may say that solo is overhyped. Some people may say that Gilmour has done better solos. And yeah, I think Sorrow is actually a pretty good addition to, say, his catalog of solos, if you want to call it that. It would be hard to deny the just how good the solo is and how it seems like with every live performance I've found of him playing that song, he changes it a little bit, but it still conveys the real emotion and has the same impact on it each time. And that is definitely a solo that you put on and then you just turn up. Just like with Stairway, where you turn that up a little bit, this one, I think you turn it up a bit more. You just turn it up, listen to it, let yourself get lost in it, and it just ends too early. It actually, in reality, it probably is the perfect length for a solo, but it leaves you wanting more, not in a bad way. It's because it is so satisfying to listen to. It conveys such a particular type of feeling that when it ends, you want to listen to it again. And again, and again, but really, you're wasting time and preventing yourself from getting to side 4 of the album, which I think is a really strong side 4. So, I'll try and speed through side 4 a little bit because I don't want to spoil too much of it, but let's just say that you have a interesting inclusion of the theme of fascism on this side. Basically, I guess Roger Waters is saying that his isolation from everyone has caused him to be so disconnected from his audience that he starts to feel that it is basically just like a Hitler rally, which, when you consider the origin of the wall, where it does come from him spinning on a fan on the last concerts of the In the Flesh tour, which was the tour that they had for the Animals album back in 1977. It kind of came from his feeling of being disconnected from his audience from all the success. I mean, I guess I kind of, you could see how you would get to a conclusion like that, but I think looking at it in a more, say, a little bit more of a universal sense, where maybe it's not necessarily just fascism, but general dictatorships. I think the fascism part is just a convenient inclusion because of what would happen, I'm trying to think, at that point, like, 40 years prior. Wow. I just saw something. When this video comes out, it's going to be, like, it's actually, this album would actually be closer to, I guess it would be closer to, like, the day that Germany invaded Poland than today. Wow. Going back to, just the music, I suppose that idea is one to think about. Just from being so disconnected from humans, you also end up losing your humanity, and I think that's a great inclusion on the album. And you get some pretty awesome songs in there. You get a reprisal of In the Flesh. You get Run Like Hell, which is just a song that just rides a groove throughout the whole duration of it. Yeah, it is one that is just an awesome song where you listen to it, it's like, here we go. Time for something that just kicks some serious fucking ass. Then you get Waiting to the Worms, which pretty much just builds up to the climax of not just this side of the album, as this one I would kind of say is a little bit of the climax of at least what's going on this side of the album, but it really just builds up to what is the ultimate climax of the whole album, which is The Trial. Now, I'm not going to talk about The Trial at all because I think it is one that you just have to experience. I'll say this, when I got to the end of The Trial and got to Outside the Wall, it was what made me realize I had just listened to something that was huge and important that I should have paid more attention to. So, when you do listen to The Trial, do pay attention to what's going on there, because I think it will be a track that you'll listen to like, this is an awesome ending to the album. And, yeah, it is an awesome ending to the album. This is an album that I fucking love. It is an album that I'm pretty sure I'm going to keep listening to until the day I die. I'm going to listen to it in moderation, of course, but I don't want to hate this album at any point. That would be quite the shame. But it is an album that really shaped how I look at the, really how music can be made and how it can be constructed to form something that is simultaneously beautiful. I think this album is so beautiful, but it is also a very ugly album because it shows a darker side of humanity and really themes that you may or may not get in some other music that's at least to such a serious degree as this. It is an album that really does have a universal appeal to it because of it being so focused on these really human emotions and these really feelings that I think most people would feel at some point. And it's also not as, say, like, overdone as something like Love. It's not as overdone as just really being depressed, because it's more focused on just the idea of isolation. Because yeah, there are some depressing parts of this, but it isn't just like, if you're like, oh, I don't want to just listen to another depressing album. This isn't it. This isn't it. This album isn't just going to look at depression, because that's not the main focus of it. That's just something that is part of the overall idea of isolation and loss of contact with humanity. So as such, I say that this album is a very beautiful album, and it's one that I am so glad that I happened to come across. Not only was it the first Pink Floyd album I listened to, so from that, it led me to listen to so many awesome albums. Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals. These 4 albums are, I'd say, definitely in my top 10 albums. And perhaps even all together, I'd say. Maybe I'd have a album or 2 somehow splitting these up. I'd have to really think about it, though. But I am quite confident in saying that these 4 albums are definitely some of my favorite albums ever. And I'm glad that I was able to find Pink Floyd from The Wall. I'm glad that The Wall exists, because it is definitely a album that changes perspectives on music, on a lot of ideas, and overall it is a very enjoyable album. Now I'll just wrap this up by talking about a couple other albums. So if you have listened to The Wall, and you're now listening to this now, yeah, let me know what you think about it. I'm curious about what other people think about this album, because I know that I really love this album. But I know that some people also don't love it as much. Like, they may say, yeah, it's a good album, but it's not their best album. I'm curious why. Or hell, if you hate this album, I'd be curious to know why. I find different perspectives on things interesting. So to have someone that has such a different perspective to me on this album, like, say why they would have the polar opposite perspective, yeah, I'm curious. So if you want some more music after listening to this, if you want an album that is in the similar vein as The Wall, looking at kind of similar ideas and is as dark, oddly enough, listen to 9 Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral. That's actually another album that comes really close to being my favorite. I'd still call it one of my favorites, but it is... If The Wall is a 10, this is like a high 9. Yeah, it's a high 9, The Downward Spiral. It is a very different sound to The Wall, so if you're expecting it to sound like The Wall... Yeah, no, it's going to sound like 9 Inch Nails, but it is an album that I like, and some people may like as well. If you want more Pink Floyd, though, listen to Dark Side of the Moon, definitely, if you haven't already. If you have listened to it, then Wish You Were Here and Animals. Listen to those 2 albums, because they are fantastic. I actually love those albums more than Dark Side of the Moon. And that's not to say Dark Side of the Moon is bad. Dark Side of the Moon is definitely a good album, but in terms of what I found enjoyable, I actually liked Animals and Wish You Were Here more. Anyway, that has been me talking for almost 40 minutes about Pink Floyd's The Wall. So, yeah, if you haven't listened to The Wall somehow, listen to it. You must listen to this album. You won't regret it, because it is such a universal album. It is such an appealing album. It is just such a good album, and has so many reasons why. It has good songs. It has a really interesting approach to, and really, I'd say it pulls off the approach it takes to looking at these kind of different and perhaps not quite as talked about in as much depth themes. It is an album that I'm so glad to have listened to, and it has definitely shaped my view on music. Isn't this where